Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the grand finale of our 6-week tour inside the story, substance, and significance of the book that defines Judaism. Today we are doing lesson 6, the Talmud until today, and we are going to try in 90 minutes to cover what has happened with the Talmudic literature over the 15 centuries since the Talmud was closed. So you might remember that over the past 3-4 weeks, today's lesson is generously sponsored by Mr. Mike Rosenberg, and we thank him for that. You might remember that over the past 6 weeks, we have primarily been talking about a period of 600 years. I've been introducing you to the Mishnah and the Gemara, right? Which means that we're talking about roughly from the year 100 BCE until the year, or maybe 200 BCE, till roughly the year 500 to the Common Era, which is when the Talmud was completed. And that was all fine and dandy, but today I'd like to try and cover what happened from when the Talmud closed until today. Now, we've learned that from Sinai until the time of the Mishnah, there was consensus when it came to Jewish practice, when it came to Jewish study. How did that consensus work? It all revolved around something that was called the Sanhedrin, right? The Sanhedrin was the Jewish central court, the Supreme Court, if you will. Any question that people had, they brought it to smaller courts until it eventually made it to the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin either came to a consensus based on what all the rabbis knew, or they voted on a consensus, and that became the consensus from then on. Beautiful. It was a wonderful way of things working. That stopped around the time of the Mishnah, and we discussed some of the historical elements that led to that. And then with the Gemara as well. Okay, beautiful. By the time the Gemara was finalized, thousands of halachic questions had been examined, debated, and resolved. And I think it's important to understand that these rulings, the decision, which a lot of them were not even necessarily things that had been passed on since Sinai, but rather were decisions by the sages, consensus based on the rules that they knew of how to derive things from the Torah. We discussed that, a lot of that in lesson 1. Regardless of whether it was just a tradition that had been passed down, we knew it to be so, or whether there was a consensus that was agreed upon by everybody, regardless, the Talmud reflected that. And once the Gemara was finalized, everything that the Gemara said became binding on all Jews. I think this understanding is key to appreciating the Gemara's profound impact on the 15 centuries of Jewish study that followed that. And that's why I want to open with text 1. Dave, you have your book with you?
I do.
If you can open up for us, please. Text 1. It's from Maimonides. And he explains how from pretty much the year 500 to the Common Era, when the Talmud was closed, that became the consensus. That became binding on all Jews all around the world. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, what page is that?
Text 1, page 212.
Oh, 212, wrong page, sorry.
Universal acceptance.
Universal acceptance. Ravna and Rav Ashi and their colleagues constituted the end of the era of the sages who authoritatively transmitted the oral Torah and who set in place ordinances, decrees, and customs that became accepted as normative practice for all the Jewish people. By contrast, any ordinance, decree, or custom instituted by any court that arose after the Talmud in any land, whether it was instituted for the inhabitants of that land or for any entire region, did not become accepted as normative by the entire Jewish people. Therefore, if one of the post-Talmudic scholars taught that in a specific case, the judgment ought to be a certain way, and then a later court subsequently determined that the earlier ruling was an inaccurate interpretation of the Talmud, we need not follow the earlier conclusion. We follow whichever ruling is more logically correct and in greater accordance with the Talmud, whether its author lived in an earlier or a later generation. All decisions recorded in the Babylonian Talmud, however, are obligatory upon the entire Jewish people.
Thank you, Dave. The Rambam is essentially telling us two things. Number one, he's telling us the conclusions of the Talmud are binding. So in other words, we learned, for example, with the story of Passover, everybody remember that? We learned this whole argument in the sugya that we did in lesson 3, and we revisited it again in lesson 4, and a little bit in lesson 5. We've been talking about whether you're supposed to eat on the whether you have to stop eating on the afternoon before the Seder, right? We learned in lesson 4, at least, I introduced you to the concept that Rav Papa and Rav Huna, who were arguing with each other about that story, or actually lived about 150 years apart from each other, right? So in other words, Rav Huna proposed one solution, and Rav Papa 150 years later, or 100 years later, proposes a different solution. That cannot happen now. I can't jump into that mix and say Zoshi Rifkin proposes a different solution 1,500 years later. It doesn't work that way. Once the Talmud was concluded, it became binding on all Jews. Now, I recognize the big question that was why, but before we get to that, the Rambam is also telling us a second thing, that anything that happened after the Talmud was closed, after the Talmud's conclusion, that is actually open to interpretation. In other words, if 300 years after the Talmud, in one city, one rabbi came to a conclusion, and in another city, another rabbi came to a different conclusion, the people from this city, the people from that city, can actually follow their rabbis. All right? And there actually was one major split in Judaism, and it had a lot to do with geographic locations. Can anybody tell me what they're called? Ashkenazi and Sephardic.
Sephardic.
There you go. Very good. You all had it on the tip of your tongues, right? That only happens after the Talmud. Okay? And we're soon going to see why. It's going to have a lot to do with why we look at the Talmud as binding. Now, if that's the case, so since the Talmud, who are these people that are drawing halachic conclusions, even if they're arguing with each other and they're doing it in different locales, and I understand that the ones in this locale are only binding for that locale, and one in this locale only binding that locale, who are these people? They are called poskim, and it's our next key term. It's on page 214. In the singular, the word is posek. In the plural, the word is poskim. It is literally it means a decisor, or practically what it means is a rabbi with the authority to render a verdict on a question of halacha. In other words, it needs to be a rabbi who knows the process of how halacha works, and will then go ahead and give you, based on his understanding of the Talmud, how he feels this should be applied to a new situation. In other words, obviously, there's going to be questions today that didn't apply 100 years ago. There's going to be questions that applied 100 years ago that didn't apply 1,500 years ago, right? So ever since the Talmud, there has still been a need for what we call poskim, or these halachic decisors who are taking the Talmud and applying it to today. They will never argue with the Talmud, but they will draw their own conclusions based on the Talmud, right? And that's not binding on everyone. If he does so in Germany, and then there's another community in France, they can each follow their rabbi, and that's fine. That is what has happened since then. Now, the big question is why? Why did the Talmud become binding on everyone? Okay? And a lot of this is simply historical. The Rambam, Maimonides, suggests that simply because historically, up until that point, the Jews were for the most part centered in one locale. Torah study was centered in one locale. And after that, it spread all around the world. That's why there is that general shift. Let's see how he discusses this in text 2. Phil, if I can ask you to read for us, please, on page 214, post-Talmudic dispersion.
After the era of Rav Ashi, the people of Israel grew increasingly dispersed throughout the world, reaching the furthest geographic extremes and the most remote islands. War became more prevalent, and travel was impeded by armed forces. The study of Torah dwindled, and students no longer attended yeshivot in their thousands and myriads as before.
Thank you. When the Mishnah was compiled in the early 3rd century, it reflected a consensus of all the sages in the land of Israel. That wasn't difficult. That's where all the Jewish people were. By the time the Gemara was completed in the 5th century, Jewish scholarship had shifted to Bavel. But even so, it was 2 major hubs. We learned about this last week and the week before, Israel and Babylon. And it was only a 3-week donkey ride between the two of them. So sure, I'm sure we know that there were disagreements between the way things were being discussed in Israel and the way things were being discussed in Babylon. But yet, simultaneously, we have in the Talmud, we have discussion about people who journeyed from one to the other and brought scholarship from one to the other. Beautiful. But by the time the 6th century rolls around, the Jewish world becomes embattled in lots and lots of wars. There's the Byzantine-Sasanian War of the first quarter of the 7th century, which is followed shortly afterwards by the Muslim conquest. Meanwhile, the Western Roman Empire had collapsed in the 5th and 6th centuries. There's a lot going on that's slowly making the Jews scatter more and more and more and more. If you want to start tracing, for example, when Judaism reaches Europe, sure, it arrives there towards the end of the millennium, but by the 6th and 7th centuries, Jews start to trickle into Europe. And then it starts to become hubs for Judaism, obviously, as time goes on and on. I don't know enough about all the history to know exactly when each location became a hub for whatever, but you can imagine that as empires are rising and falling and doing battle with each other, Jews that end up stuck in one area kind of create their own hub of Torah scholarship. We know that by the 13th century, there was a huge hub in France. Remember how we started our course with the story of the burning of the Talmud, right? That was already after a few hundred years of scholarship in medieval times in France, right? So the Rambam is essentially saying that this is a big part of why, essentially what he's saying is like this: the Talmud acted as the last de facto Sanhedrin that we have ever had. The Sanhedrin was an actual group of people, right? But after that, we had the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the Gemara acting as a Sanhedrin. Why? Because there was a consensus of all the Jewish rabbis at the time. By the time they put it together, nobody argued with it. Once he put it out, it was considered such a magnum opus, such a beautiful work of art, that everybody was like, yes, we agree with everything that's in there. That's a consensus of everybody. Nobody argues with it. I mean, obviously, in it there are arguments, and that's a whole different discussion on how we get the halacha out of the Talmud, and it's one of our next discussions. But you cannot argue with what it says in the Talmud, because that essentially became a de facto Sanhedrin that was the last Sanhedrin until Mashiach comes, when we'll be able to pursue this operation again. Okay. So what I'd like to do now with you is two very important things if we're going to actually understand what happened in the 15 centuries since the Talmud was concluded. We have to divide today's lesson into two portions. And that is, number one, I'm going to frame them as questions. Number one, I'd like to try and answer for you, how do we reach a halacha for practical observance? Okay, so in the Talmud, as you saw, every single sugya has different opinions, different things, and sure, we try to figure out what the halacha is, and sometimes the Talmud will tell you what the halacha is, but very often the Talmud just leaves it open-ended. It was a conversation, and this is where it lands. And now you know what this person's opinion was, you know what that person's opinion was, etc., right? But halacha means way. Halacha means a practical way. And as we know that with halacha, you need to have a binary. You need to either follow black or white, right? So the question is, how do we do so? And the second thing that I'd like to address you today is completely irrespective of halacha, just the ongoing intellectual exercise. How has that conversation that began with the Talmud been continuing until today? How does that continue to evolve? I get it. I cannot argue with Rav Huna or Rav Papa, and we just discussed one of the main reasons why. I cannot argue with the Talmud, but can we continue to discuss the Talmud and apply it to today? I'm sure most of you have guessed correctly that the answer is yes. How does that conversation evolve until today? So these are the two questions that I'd like to answer for you today. And I'll tell you a fun fact. I'm going to do them each in about 30 minutes, and then we'll do a course conclusion. That's today's lesson in a nutshell. And for each one of them, we're going to do a sample. So when I'm answering question number one, which is how do we reach a halacha for practical observance, we're going to use the first sugya about the afternoon before Passover and whether we're allowed to eat before Passover. And we're going to take that Gemara, well, that Mishnah really, and to the Gemara, and we're going to try and bring it all the way to halacha and understand how somebody today would know which way to actually practically observe Judaism. Okay, how to answer that question. So in other words, for the first one, we're going to use our first sugya. And yep, you guessed it, to answer the second question about how the conversation began with the Talmud continues to evolve today, we're going to use the second sugya, which was the one we discussed last week, if you remember, about the employees and the employers that had a disagreement about how much to be charged, etc. There was a hiring agent involved in the middle and all that, and their right to complain or their legal claim, right? We're going to use that conversation in order to see how that has evolved after the times of the Gemara. Everybody with me? Okay, so let's start with how do we reach a halacha for practical observance? Suppose you want to know whether it's permissible to enjoy a meal on Friday afternoon. You know that the topic is discussed in Pesachim, the tractate which talks about Passover. So you open up the book, you turn to page 99b. Now, I'm talking to a whole bunch of seasoned professionals, so you guys all know what it says there, right? There's a Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Arvei Pesachim, on the afternoon before Passover, you're not allowed to eat from close to the Mincha time, right? So you read the Mishnah, you're a little confused, so you start to go into the Gemara, and you end up with figure 6.2, right? I'm not going to go through a whole review now of the whole sugya. You guys remember it. There was a problem. The Mishnah and the Braita didn't line up. Is it Rav Yossi? Is it Rav Yehuda? We went back and forth. Rav Huna suggested a solution. Rav Papa suggested a solution. According to one of them, the Mishnah ends up being Rav Yossi. According to one of them, the Mishnah ends up being Rabbi Yehuda. Depending on who you follow, right, you may end up with like a 3 o'clock cutoff time for eating before Mincha. You may end up, for eating before Passover. You may end up with a 3:30 cutoff time, or you may end up with no cutoff time at all, or you may end up with right? So, as you can see, going through the Gemara and trying to figure it out from there, you need to be able to answer certain questions before you can, like, for example, a very basic question. If it turns out that Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda are arguing with each other, who does the halacha follow between the two of them, right? And if their argument, for example, is not about whether you can eat on Passover afternoon, but whether it's 3 o'clock or 3:30, which one does it follow? As you can see, deriving halachic rulings from the Talmud is not going to be an easy task, even with all the translations and detailed explanations that we have available to us. So now imagine how much more challenging it might have been if they didn't have the translations, and they didn't have beautiful graphs like we have on page 216, this figure which goes through the whole thing. And they're trying to figure out, just tell me if I can have a snack. I have an apple in front of me. Tell me if I can do it or not. Tell me if I can eat it or not, right? The Rambam does such a fantastic job. Ron, if I can ask you to read it for us, please. The Rambam does such a fantastic job of clarifying, describing this challenge. The challenge of Talmud study. Ron, when you're ready.
On page 217,
You got it.
the Talmud's manner of expression is extremely profound. Furthermore, it is composed in Aramaic with some other languages thrown in as well. That vernacular was well understood by all the Jews of Babylon during the era in which the Talmud was composed. In other locations, however, and even within Babylonia, during the subsequent era of the Geonim, no one could understand this language without being taught.
So, your first challenge is going to be, if you don't know Aramaic, you're going to have a problem. Okay, but let's assume you know Aramaic, right? Now you start to go through it, and you see there's a lot of problems. So the best thing for us to do is, why don't we turn to the 600s? Who lived in the 600s? And what were they doing? They had already established that the Talmud is binding on everyone, right? How were they applying the law? It turns out that the people who lived in that era have a name today. We call them the Geonim. It's your key term on page 218. Gaon in the singular and Geonim in the plural. Gaon is the Hebrew word for splendor or pride, and it refers to a leader or multiple leaders of the great Talmudic academies of Babylonia during the 7th until the 11th centuries. That's considered roughly the year 600 till the year 1100 is roughly what we consider the period of the Geonim. And they were the first ones to say, listen, we have the Talmud, we trust the Talmud. The Talmud is binding on everyone. We're not changing that. But now somebody asked me if I'm allowed to eat an apple or an apple or a piece of bread on Erev Pesach afternoon. And I need to give him not a whole conversation about Rav Huna and Rav Papa, I need to give him a yes or a no answer, right? So how do I get from here to there, right? And the good news is we have extant a lot of their works of the Geonim, and we can see their process as they riddled it out. And in Hebrew, these are called Shalot Utshuvot HaGaonim, which means the questions and answer, or in short, the answers that were given by the Gaonim to the questions that were posed to them. In English, they came up with this word. I've never heard it used for anything else. I don't really understand how it helps us to have an English word. It's called responsa. And in these responsa, what you see is that they're working very, very diligently with the text of the Talmud. You see a question being posed, so let's take our question. Someone comes over to a Gaon and says, hey, am I allowed to eat a snack on the afternoon, at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the day before the Seder? And you see the Gaon quote the Talmud, go through it, and come to a conclusion to this halachic question. A lot of the questions that we have till today sorry, a lot of the halachas that we have till today were riddled out of the Gemara by the Geonim. And there were lots of rules. Rules like precedence of when you lived. So if there's Rav Huna and Rav Papa, maybe we go according to the one who lived later. We already encountered some of these rules. When you have Rav and Shmuel, oh, this one lived in Israel, so therefore he wouldn't have had any practical application of civil law, but this one lived in Babylon, so he would have had practical application of civil law. This one was superior in this field, this one was superior in that field. And lots of reasons for why to rule according to one opinion versus another opinion. Lots of reasons for why to trust one sugya over another sugya. The same topic can be discussed two places in the Talmud, and they use all of this kind of logical reasoning to deduce this. What do I mean that we can see their process in play? We're not going to do that in today's lesson. It would be way too difficult to add that to the lesson. But often you read a full responsa from one of them. Now, the way responsa worked wasn't binary. It wasn't yes or no. It wasn't somebody asking you a question, can I have a snack on the day before Pesach afternoon? And there was the answer yes or no. It was actually much more nuanced than that. They would say, well, in order to answer your question, let's go to the verse in the Torah. That's where they started often. And it was basically like an essay as a response. And that essay literally tackled and collected from all, and by the way, they did this without Google, they did this without hyperlinks, they did this without the internet, they were collecting from all over. This is the verse in the Torah that's relevant to your question. This is the Mishnah which quotes the oral law which discusses your question. I know it doesn't feel relevant right now, but give me a second. The Gemara discusses it, and the Gemara comes to this, and I'm telling you that the way to apply it is X. I don't think it's a big leap to say that because the Gemara applied it in this way, therefore this is the answer to your question, and therefore yes or no. We have lots of tshuvot like that. Tshuvot means answers, responsa, which they are responding to questions that are being posed to them. Let me give you some examples. Look on page 219. You can see some of them. It's just a figure that has, examples of Geonic responsa. For example, the custom of reciting Kol Nidre on Yom Kippur, which we all take as like standard. Of course, it's part of the liturgy to say Kol Nidre as part of Yom Kippur, right? But Rabbi Natronai Gaon, who passed away in 858, right? So lived probably the beginning of the 8th century. End of the 8th century. He says, we have heard that this prayer is recited in other lands, however, it's not our custom in Babylonia. Could you imagine? Kol Nidre was one of these things that in one city they had decided to do it, in another city they had not. And here he's discussing it, and he gives a law that, at least at the time, at some point it obviously became the liturgy for everyone, and that could be a class on Kol Nidre, independent, and people do give classes on the history of things like Kol Nidre. But definitely in the 800s, it seems Rabbi Natronai Gaon was saying that in his locale, people should not say Kol Nidre because it's not our custom here in Babylonia. Another interesting one is two more down. Rav Shrira Gaon, living in the 900s, answers a simple question: is astrology authentic? Right? And he basically riddles it out, quotes the Talmud from Brachot, goes through the whole sugya there, and then goes and then comes to the conclusion that even if astrology is authentic, it can only determine a particular inclination. However, individuals always maintain the free choice to commit or refrain from a specific action, and so forth and so on. In other words, this was a whole body of literature that we have. We don't even have all of them, but we have many of them till today. And you can see how they were paskening, or how they were ruling halachic decisions out of the Talmud for the people that lived in their areas. There is a cool website. I don't remember what it's called. The project is called Hamapah. And Hamapah, Hamapah, which means the map in Hebrew. Hamapah is a project where they take these responsa, because a lot of them have, as you can see, sometimes the questioner is unknown, but often you see who it was from. Like the second one was from Rabbi Yaakov and Nissim of Karawan, Tunisia, and being posed to Rav Shrira Gaon, who I believe lived in Babylon, etc., right? So, one of the things that this website, this Hamapah, does is they've taken rabbis, and based on their tremendous works, which sometimes like 3 or 4 volumes of responsa that they have, they've taken just the metadata, that's what we call it today, of each questioner. Right? So let's say, this question came from Tunisia, this question came from Morocco, this question came from whatever, right? And they've made maps, heat maps, to see how far the influence of any particular posek, which means somebody who was a decisor, who was ruling halacha based on the Talmud, how far their influence reached. And you can see that each one reached much further than just their simple locale. Once they became well known as a posek of that generation, as someone who was experienced in ruling, difficult questions would come to them, and they became what was known as posek hador, which means a decisor leading that generation. And often, in some very exciting generations, you can see a few different beacons of light on their maps. You can see, let's say, in the 800s, you'll have this going in this city and that going in that city, and each of them is reaching much further until they even cross over a little bit. You can imagine somebody in the middle saying, our choices are to go to this one or to that one. It's a really cool visualization of some of these things that are happening in that era. Now, this continued roughly until the year 1100. Somewhere in the 1000s, the beginning of the new millennium, is when the Gaonim end and the Rishonim begin. The Rishonim is the next generation of scholars, and I want to focus particularly on one of them, actually on two of them. The first one is Rabbi Yitzchak Elfasi, okay? You can start to see him discussed on page 220. Rabbi Yitzchak Elfasi was the first one to take the Talmud and say, is there a way we can digest this into something that's much more palatable if all you want to do is get the halacha? Right? So think of the Yerushalmi. You guys remember that? The Jerusalem Talmud was much more concise, much more to the point. So he took the Babylonian Talmud, because remember the Babylonian Talmud was 200 years later. So that's definitely the final say. And he took that, and what he did was he digested it to get only the halacha, only the law. All right? Let's use our sugya of whether you're allowed to eat on the afternoon before Passover as our case study. Okay, so we all remember the Mishnah. We all remember the Gemara that followed it. Now let's go to the probably late 1000s, early 1100s, and let's see how the Rif takes that Talmud, and in his work, he digests it by omitting a lot of pieces of the Talmud and adding in. In other words, he didn't take new language. He took the language of the Talmud. Let's say our sugya was 22 lines, if I remember correctly. He shortened it, as you'll see, to 5 lines, or sorry, less, to 3 lines, then added in 2 new lines, and that's his commentary. In other words, he was trying to digest it into something that was palatable specifically for the agenda of halacha, of knowing how to practically observe the law. Let's see how he does so. It's text 4a. Mark, can you unmute yourself and read for us, please? Text 4a on page 220, Halachic Digest.
Mishnah, one must refrain from eating on the eve of Passover from close to the time for reciting the Mincha prayers until after darkness has fallen. Gemara, we learned in a Barata, one should not eat on the eves of Shabbat or the festivals from time of Mincha and onward, so that the one enters Shabbat or the festivals with an appetite. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Conversely, Rabbi Yoshi says that one may continue eating until it grows dark. The law follows the view of Rabbi Yoshi because there is a rule that the law favors Rabbi Yoshi over his colleagues. And our Mishnah regarding Passover Eve concurs with all views because Rabbi Yoshi will concede that eating is prohibited on the eve of Passover due to the obligation to eat matzah.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So we are now in the 1000s, and now I'm a nice fine Jew, and I come to my rabbi and I say, hey, rabbi, am I allowed to eat on the afternoon before Passover? But now the rabbi has, well, not 1000s, let's say we're living in the 1100s, just for safety, right? Let's say that. Now the rabbi has this new work that he can use. What is this work? Instead of him going through the whole Talmud and trying to piece it out and writing a whole essay based on it, what does he do? He opens up the Rif. The Rif, or Rabbi Yitzchak Elfasi, has this digest. Now let's see what he did. Text 4b, okay, is the original words from the Talmud. Okay? Do you see how long it is? And you can see how they kind of crossed out, if you will. I want to say, what, 8/10 of the text. That's what the Rif did. And then he added in text 4a, you can see that certain words are not as bold, they're like kind of gray. Those words are the new words that he added in. And now, if you just look at text 4a, you should be able to easily answer the question that was posed to you if you're a rabbi. So let's go through it. Exercise 6.3, right? Nice fine Jew comes over to you. You're the rabbi. You have the Rif text, this new wonderful work of a halachic digest of the Talmud. And you want to use the Rif's text to answer two simple questions. Number one, is a meal permitted on the eve of Passover? So you turn to text 4a and you look through and you say, Rabbi Yossi said that you're allowed to continue eating until it grows dark. The law favors the view of Rabbi Yossi. Based on this rule, the law favors Rabbi Yossi over his colleagues. And Rabbi Yossi will concede that eating is prohibited on the eve of Passover. So now, this guy has a simple question. Are you allowed to eat on the eve of Passover? The answer is no. Next question, is a meal permitted on the eve of Shabbat or other festivals? Well, Rabbi Yossi only considered when it came to Passover. Sure, Rabbi Yehuda would say that you're not allowed to eat on the afternoon before Shabbat or festivals, but it seems like the halacha doesn't follow Rabbi Yehuda. The halacha follows Rabbi Yossi. So in other words, based on a simple reading of the Rif, you now have this much better grasp of exactly what the halacha is. So to the first question, you would answer no, and to the second question, you would answer yes. And just like that, you have a much simpler halacha in front of you. Now, does that mean that the Rif did that for every single... The Rif did do that for the entire Talmud. It was a commentary written on the entire Talmud. I don't know if written is the right word, but he digested the entire Talmud in this way. Does that mean that there won't still be questions? Of course there will still be questions, because the Rif, as well as the Talmud, didn't discuss electricity. So when electricity comes out, there's going to be a whole new discussion. But at least when it comes to the long conversations in the Talmud, what he's done is he's digested it into simple halachas. Okay. Let's go a little bit further. And I should clarify, by the way, that the Rif's Halachic Digest quickly became a staple in Talmudic study, helping students summarize the conclusions of each sugya to be able to understand what the law is. Beautiful. But however, it was still a digest. It wasn't a legal code. Today, I'm sure many of you have heard the term a code of Jewish law. The first and most famous codifier of Jewish law was, of course, Maimonides. Maimonides, as he says himself in his introduction to the Mishneh Torah, which was his magnum opus, Mishneh Torah meaning the double to the Torah, he felt you can learn the written law. And then he wasn't negating the Talmud. But he was saying that while you should study the Talmud, for law specifically, to know what to do, halacha, you should learn the Torah and then my book, Mishneh Torah. That's why he called it the second to the Torah. And in his introduction to it, he explains what he's trying to do and what's different about what he's doing. He doesn't quote the Rif by name, but what's different about what he's doing, different than the Rif or Rabbeinu Yitzchak Alfasi, is that instead of digesting it, he's making a new code. Let's see his words, how he explains what his agenda is here. Elise, I'm not sure if you're with us, but I'd love for you to read text 5. Are you here? If you are, please unmute yourself. Yeah, you are.
I am. Yes,
Go ahead. Text 5 on page 224, the creation of a code. The first code of Jewish law, if you will.
Okay. Therefore, I, Moses, the son of Maimon of Spain, girded my loins. I relied upon the rock. Blessed be he. I examined all these texts and set out to compile the conclusions that can be extracted from all these texts as to what is forbidden and what is permitted, what is ritually impure and what is ritually pure, and the rest of the Torah's laws. I will present all the conclusions in clear language and a concise format, so that the entire oral law will be easily accessible to everyone without questions or objections.
Thank you very much. Now remember, the Rambam is living just 100 years later, end of the 1100s. So now let's go through this scenario again. You're a rabbi. Somebody comes over to you, and now it's the middle of the 1200s, and you have the Rambam already, right? You have Maimonides' codified legal code, right? Book of legal code. And somebody asks you the same question. Hey, I'd like to eat on the afternoon before Passover, right? Now you have a much better work in front of you. And soon we're going to read exactly how the Rambam addresses this same question in text 6. But what I want you to note is that in text 6, you will see, number 1, it's much more practical. Number 2, it's an independent piece. He's writing his own words. He's let go of the words of the Talmud. It's still based on what the Talmud said, but he's writing it in a much more... It frees him to be able to write it in a much more direct way. And remember, he's 600 years after the Talmud at this point, or at least after the Talmud was concluded. language has changed as well, right? So being able to give this upfront, organized by topic, clear and concise halachic form allows him much more freedom to be able to make it much more clear and accessible to all Jews. So if you're a rabbi and you're trying to answer it, now you turn to the Rambam. This is, again, mid-1200s, and you turn to text 6, which is the law in the Rambam that deals with this. Phil, if you can read for us, please. Codifying Pesachim, page 225.
It is forbidden to eat on the eve of Passover from a little before the time for mincha, so that we arrive at the eating of matzah with an appetite. However, we may eat a small quantity of fruit or vegetables as long as we do not eat enough to feel full. By contrast, on the eves of Shabbat or the other festivals, we may continue eating until dark.
This is amazing, because this is just 3 lines in the Hebrew. The Rambam analyzed the entire sugya that we learned for the first time in lesson 3. He analyzed the entire thing for us. He reached the same conclusion as the Rif, which is that the halacha follows Rabbi Yossi, and it's according to Rav Huna's interpretation. I don't expect you guys to remember all these details in the sugya, but that's okay. But which means that the prohibition applies only on the eve of Pesach and not on Shabbat and other holidays. He's also including in here an insight which we never learned. But on page 107, 8 pages later, the Talmud discusses what exactly is this meal that's prohibited on the afternoon before the Seder. And the Talmud says it's more mainly talking about bread or matzah. In other words, some sort of washing that's actually sitting down for a meal. But fruits and vegetables or a drink, you're fine. Then the Talmud discusses whether wine is allowed or not, right? The Rambam puts this all into a simple 3-line text. You're not allowed to eat, but that applies to let's say matzah or anything else you would wash on, and he gives you a specific time. If you notice that, right? He says from a little before the time of mincha. In other words, 3 o'clock, not 3:30. For those of you that remember the exact details of that conversation. And notice how the Rambam's presentation of this law is entirely independent of the Talmud's text. It's no longer using the words of the Talmud. He's just giving you a code. And in his precise and clear Hebrew, the Rambam presents all the practical information of the Talmud that was offered about everything, not just laws of eating on Pesach Eve, of everything, in 14 volumes, known as the Yad HaChazaka, or the powerful hand. Yad, because Yud Dalid is the numerical equivalent of 14, and there's 14 volumes to his work, and that, if you're living in the mid-1200s, that's where you would turn in order to get halacha. Okay. As you can imagine, the development of halachic codes did not end with the Rambam. In many cases, the halachic conclusions that he derived from the Talmud were ambiguous, plus new questions and customs and ordinances. At this point, there's Ashkenazi and there's Sephardi, and there's all different sorts of other elements that you might want to include when you're making a halachic code. So in the 1400s, we get probably the most important one to date. I'm not taking away from the importance of the Rambam. I'm not taking away from the importance of the Rif. I'm not taking away from the importance of the responsa of the Geonim, but in the 1400s, probably the most important and relevant to us comes the Shulchan Aruch, in Hebrew known as the Set Table, written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo and others. And this is where a Jew today would turn in order to get the halacha. I think, for the sake of not being exhaustive, they didn't include the text from there, but let me pull it up for you here. All right, so if you were to open up a Shulchan Aruch, this is a website called Sefaria that has text of Shulchan Aruch. You open it up, Siman 471, right, which means chapter, basically, 471. Be'erev Pesach, on the day before Passover, Achar Shah, a series after the 10th hour, Asur le'achol pat, you're not allowed to eat bread. And he explains, you're not allowed to eat from the 10th hour and on, in order to eat, I'm roughly translating as I'm going through it, in order to eat the matzah that evening with an appetite, but you are allowed to eat fruits and vegetables, but you shouldn't, even eating fruits and vegetables, you shouldn't fill yourself with them. He continues, what about wine? You shouldn't even drink a little bit of wine, because wine satisfies a person much more. But if you'd like to drink a lot of wine, that's fine, because to drink a lot of wine actually enhances your appetite for that evening. He continues in the second statement in this chapter. Before the 10th hour, you're allowed to eat even if you're going to wash. Look at that. Just like that, you have the halacha, you have the law. Now, far be it from me to tell you that that's where it ended. There are commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. But for the most part, the Shulchan Aruch is still what we follow till today. Like, for example, when I became a rabbi, right? When I studied for smicha, for rabbinic ordination, what did I do? I opened up that Shulchan Aruch. True, I had to study commentary on that from the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s, right? And I had to study the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, which came about later. I'm not going to complicate you guys with all these details, but for the most part, that is what we study, because that's where you get the law from. And on figure 6.4, you can see all of this summarized for you, right? Okay. And today, the Shulchan Aruch is probably the one that's the most binding and considered law. And now I'd like to explain something that maybe is a little bit off on a tangent, but I still want to explain it. If you open up your siddur, if you have one of these blue siddurim, right? If you were to open it up on one of the back pages there, this diagram is present. What is this diagram? This diagram, I think, is so beautiful because what happens when you open up a Shulchan Aruch and you just read from somebody from the 1400s, or maybe you're reading from a modern Shulchan Aruch, which is from like the 1700s or 1800s, you're just reading the law. And then maybe you're reading a little bit, and the next morning you show up to shul, and they're reading the Torah, and they happen to be reading the verse from which that law comes, right? What you're missing is this graph to go from one to the other. And often in yeshiva, not often, but sometimes in yeshiva, we used to do this interesting exercise. It was called learning aliba de hilchasa, learning Talmud, learning Torah in order to get to the law. And you would go through with one law from the beginning to the end. So let me show you how it would work. You would start at the top over here with the Tanakh, right? These three together are called the Tanakh. That's the written law, the yellow. The Pentateuch, which is the 5 books of Moses. You can see them listed there. The prophets, see them listed there, all of the books of the prophets. The holy writings, which are the scriptures, which you can see there on the bottom, which includes all the Megillas, by the way, including Megillat Esther, which we just read on Purim on Friday. Then, let's skip the Medrash because it's a conversation for a different time. That led to the Mishnah, with the 6 orders of the Mishnah, which I'm sure you remember, the Shisha Sidre, Shas, the 6 orders of the Mishnah, which you can see listed below them. Let's skip the Braita, even though you guys know what the Braita and the Tosafot is. Let's skip that for now. Continue to the Gemara, which is split into the Talmud Bavli and the Talmud Yerushalmi, right? The Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds. And then you can see that as you go down, we're going to skip. Over the course of this course, we definitely skipped little windows here and there. Like, for example, this little window, the works and responsa of the Rabbanan Svarai, which is a very short period. We skipped that today. And we moved right on to the works of the responsa of the Geonim, right? Which is where our lesson started today. They started off by giving halacha from the Gemara. And then you have Alfas, which is the Rif, which we learned about today. The Rambam Maimonides, which we learned about today. The Rosh, which we're going to skip for today. And then eventually, moving past the Tur, this continues into the Shulchan Aruch with the 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch, the Jewish Code of Law. And then on the bottom here, all the commentary on that, which I told you that this bottom section is what I studied when I was studying for rabbinic ordination, right? The purpose of this graph is to show you that the Torah which Moses commanded us is an inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. It started from Sinai, and it continues to every single one of us today. That same Torah from Sinai is the law that we are following today. I just think this is a graph that very often is good for people to have in their brains, because we don't often think about that whole chain of Masorah, that chain of tradition that's been passed down generation to generation. But seeing as you guys have already been with this course until now, hopefully this helps you quite a bit. Okay. Everything we've been discussing until now, in the past 30 minutes, has basically been to answer a simple question. What has happened in the 1500 years until today in the field of halacha? In the field of knowing how to observe Jewish law properly, right? How is there consensus? How do we follow Jewish law today? And how does that come from the Gemara, which comes from the Mishnah, which comes from Sinai? Beautiful. But what about everything else in the Gemara? What about everything that's not necessarily halacha? That's not necessarily about observance. And then you don't need to know exactly which way to follow. You don't need to choose one over the other. How has that conversation been continuing until today? Conversations such as moral conversations and ethical conversations, which, again, sometimes they end up in the field of halacha, give me a way to follow, give me a law and a binary, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just a conversation. Understanding a Gemara, which won't lead to a difference in halacha, right? It's not going to boil down to a practice. How has that conversation been continuing until today? So for this, I'd like to turn back to the daf. And I'd also like to turn the clock back. Let's go back to the time of the Rif. which to remind you is in the mid 1000s, right? Late 1000s. And around the same time that the Rif is compiling or composing his halachas to assist rabbis in extracting a ruling from the Talmud, other sages were writing other commentary on the Gemara. And their agenda was different. It had nothing to do with halacha. They were just trying to get people to be able to understand the daf. Let me explain what I mean. On the left side of the screen here, you have a picture of the daf. The daf, again, is the double-sided folio, which is the Mishnah and the Gemara, etc. Now, the only marking, by the way, disregard the gray, because that's something that was added here to the slide, because we're going to talk about that in a second. The only marking that you can, first of all, you should be very confused right now, because there's a lot going on. And I know last week I played a video which deconstructed it off and put it back together, but still it's low. If you pay attention, you will see something. The only marking that there is on this page is this. That's the only break you get. Those two letters, Gimel Mem, which stands for Gemara, are meant to differentiate for you when the, I think you have this in your book on page 228 if the screen is too small for you. That is meant to differentiate for you where the Mishnah ends and the Gemara begins. Now, I mentioned earlier that in order to illustrate this point, we're going to use the sugya, the second sugya that we learned. Remember? The one about the disagreement or the deception between the employer and the employees, right? The Mishnah started at the bottom of the previous page and ends here at the top of Daf Ayin Vav Amud Aleph, which means folio 76, side A. Okay. The only marking you get is the Gemara. Till here was the Mishnah. Now starts the Gemara. Very helpful because they're 300-400 years apart from each other, as we know. But if you take a from here down to the bottom of the page, for starters, no paragraphs. To continue, you have other problems. There's no punctuation. You don't see a single comma or period or colon or semicolon or question mark or exclamation mark. You don't see new paragraphs. By the way, you have a whole different issue, which is this is in a different language, which you need to learn, right? The Gemara is as inaccessible to us as Chinese, and maybe even more accessible. I'm sorry, maybe Chinese is even more accessible because maybe some of us know a little bit of it because we live around a whole bunch of Asian people here, right? So a lot of the commentary, what they've done is they've helped us to decode the Talmud when it was just starting, when the study of it was just burgeoning and just becoming ubiquitous among the Jewish people. So for you guys, what we did was, I wish I could take credit, what the JLI did was, first of all, they presented for you this whole sugya, which we learned. They presented it for you 3-4 words at a time. Second of all, they put the Hebrew there for you in case you read Hebrew. But then underneath it, in the translation, what they did for you was they put not a literal translation. First of all, it's translated to English, but it's not even just a literal translation in English. It's been, it's included conjunctions and connectors and fills in some implied text, etc. Right? To make it easy for you guys who don't study Talmud every day to be able to read it. But what's if I'm approaching Talmud? I want to be able to read it from the original text. And I learned a little bit of Aramaic. Not everything, right? But I know some Aramaic that I can slowly get. How am I supposed to know where to start and where to end? Now, this is a very difficult exercise for me to be able to do with you guys, right? But try to imagine it. On figure 6.6, on page 229. Imagine looking at something like that and trying to figure out where the question starts and where the question ends, and where the answer starts, where the answer ends, and whether this question is going back to this, and whether there's two parts to the question. How are you supposed to figure that out? There isn't even a paragraph break for you, right? By way of exercise, okay, I'd like to ask Dave Barron to please read for us text 7. Text 7 is their attempt at these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 lines in the Talmud that are highlighted in gray on the screen in front of you, or that are on in the image on page 229, the figure 6.6. Text 7 is a raw translation, the raw Talmud. No periods, no punctuation, nothing. Read it for me, please, Dave, and tell me if you understand what's going on here. Dave, you're muted. My apologies.
Sorry. What is the case if that the employer said to them at the 4, and he went and said to them at 3, what is the function of complaint? He knew and accepted. If the employer said to him at 3, he went and said to them at 4, what is the case? If he told them your wages are on me, he gives them from his own.
That's what it would look like if you just read Gemara. And by the way, when I was just starting to learn Gemara, I often made this mistake. You just read a sentence, like a long running sentence. You don't even realize that there's different things happening. Now, there's lots of reasons why that could be. I'm not sure that this is different than non-Jewish texts. Very often, texts that are as ancient as this, I guess they had limited ink and limited, writing form, and they didn't want things to be too long, so they wrote shorter, and they didn't put punctuation, etc. As time evolved, these things became things. I didn't Google when punctuation was invented, but this was certainly before it. And as a result, you have that as one of your major issues. So a lot of the commentary, what they're doing is they're just trying to help you work your way through the text. And foremost in this regard is Rashi. But before we read how Rashi helps us get through this text, what I'd like to do with you is the following. Let's just go through this text 7. Take out your pen. I'm going to help you put in some punctuation, okay? And while I do so, I'm going to give you numbers, okay? And those numbers are going to be what we did when we did it in lesson 5 last week. We called them different steps of the sugya. But again, that was because we were introducing it to you and serving it to you on a silver platter. But let me show you how you would parse this out. Let's start from the beginning. Put a number 1. First step, what is the case? Now you can put a question mark. All right? Now you can put a little number 2. If that the employer said to them at 4, comma, and he went and said to them at 3, period, that is the answer. Okay? Now you can put a period after that. Now you can put a little 3, which is the next step of the Gemara. It's a question. What is the function of complaint? Right? So the Gemara is essentially challenging the first attempt at an answer. Right? Now you can put a question mark after what is the function of complaint. Then you can put a little number 4, and you can say he knew and accepted! Exclamation mark. That would be the end of step 4. Now you can start step 5. So if the employer said to him at 3, comma, and he went and said to them at 4, period, that was step 5, which is the next attempt at an answer. But again, the Gemara asks, you could put a 6, what is the case? Question mark. And now you can put a little number 7, next attempt at an answer. If he told them your wages are on me, right? Period, because that's the attempt at an answer. Now you can put a little number 8. He gives them from his own. Question mark. In other words, the Gemara is asking a question. Shouldn't he give them from his own? Does anybody recognize this now a little bit as corresponding to the first 8 steps of the, 11 step or 12 step sugya that we did last week, where we went through step by step by step? These questions are 2-word questions. Hey Chidami, what is the case? Right? So who comes in and rescues us? How does JLI put it so beautifully for you? For many years they struggled, until along came the most important commentary to the Gemara. And you can find him on the inside of any daf. In other words, you see how there's the right and the left? If this is a page, this particular page is a left-sided page. The way I know that is because Rashi always appears on the inside. So if it's a left-sided page, he'll be on the right. If it's a right-sided page, he'll be on the left. In other words, he's the inside margin of each page. You can see right here where my cursor is going over it, right? Or where this one line is highlighted. This one line is going to be our sample Rashi. Let's do it. It's text 8. Okay? So Dave, since you read for us this cryptic one, Ron, why don't you read for us at least one line, right? Which is the first 2 words of the sugya. Hey Chidami, which is the Gemara asking, what is the case? Rashi clarifies for us what the question is here. You want to read it for us? This is page 230, text 8.
That gives them a right to complain, but nothing more.
Rashi is the one who tells us about the little peak. You guys remember from last week? The peak that we're trying to balance on, where there's no legal claim, but there is a right to complain. Rashi says that's the problem that the Gemara is trying to riddle out. And he helps us. He helps us. He helps serve it for us on a silver platter. He tells us, you want to know what the Gemara is asking? What is the case? The Gemara is struggling to find a case which is, on the one hand, no legal claim, but on the other hand, they do have a right to complain. Rashi is the one who tells that to us. Who is Rashi? Rashi is an acronym for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. He was a French scholar. You can read about him in the margin, I think, somewhere here. Maybe they don't have one. Anyways, he has a fascinating life. I think it's beyond the scope of today's lesson. But Rashi does a lot of things very similar to text 8. What does he do? His work becomes the authoritative guide to Talmud study. He translates words all the time from Aramaic, not regular words. These two words, heichidami, what is the case? Those are common words in the Talmud. Rashi doesn't need to translate that for us. But if there's a strange Aramaic word that only appears once or a handful of times in the Talmud, Rashi translates it for us. He translates it into Old French, which is a different job that later on needs to be translated again for us, right? But at least for that generation, it was very good. He's translating a rare plant, let's say, that the Talmud is discussing, and Rashi gives us the Old French word for it, right? Rashi explains to us when the Gemara has a question, what the Gemara means by that question. When the Gemara gives an answer, what does the Gemara mean by that answer? And it's a running commentary all along. And he essentially serves as the question marks and the periods and the commas, etc. in the Talmud. When I was in 5th grade, I had a Rebbe who used to make us do pretty much exercise 6.4, which is when we went through and tried to put in the commas and the periods and the question marks. He used to do that with us. It was the first time I learned Gemara. His name was Rabbi Zalmanov. Until today, I owe it to him. And me and other colleagues that were students together with him in 5th grade, we refer to it as the Fei Ayin Shin Zayin formula. Why? Because he told us that before we own our first volume of Gemara, we should buy, and they sold us in the Judaica stores, a pamphlet, which was basically a copy of one chapter of the Talmud. But you don't want to write in a book, right? You don't want to write in on the margins of the Gemara. You want to respect the book. So he said, buy a pamphlet, bring it in, and what I'm going to do with you is I'm going to go through it with you. And I have this pamphlet still at home from the first one that I did. I should have brought it. Maybe I'll bring it to tonight's lesson, because I still have it at home. I brought it from my parents' house. If anybody wants to see it, send me a text or an email after the class, and I'm going to find it for tonight's class, and I'll show it. And we went through, and he would say, "Hey chidami simin shaila," which in Yiddish and Hebrew means put a question mark. And then he would say, and he would read the next few words. He would say psik. Psik means comma. I used to learn in Yiddish, so he was teaching us in Yiddish. He would say the Gemara asks, make a fei, which stands for frek. The Gemara asks. In other words, he would tell us to put these little things in, and then when we would go back to read it again, we would understand how the Gemara is formulating a conversation. But the original person to do this was Rashi. The first person to actually put a commentary that can help people with this was Rashi. Rashi completed this commentary on almost the entire Shas. There are a few tractates, I think 2.5 tractates that he didn't make it to. And that became the most authoritative commentary on the Gemara. But let's go back to figure 6.5 on page 228. I only explained to you so far what's going on the right side of the Gemara. What's going on the left side of the Gemara? On the left side of the Gemara, you have something called Tosfot. Tosfot is the next generation of Talmudic scholars. They're shifting their creative focus to a different kind of commentary. And they start an era of what I would call Chidushim. Chidushim means novellae, or innovative commentaries. Okay, so Tosfot, which literally means additions, is essentially not trying to explain the Gemara to you. They're taking this a step beyond the surface. They're saying, okay, we understand now what the Gemara wants. I have a question, because the Gemara in this tractate and the Gemara in a completely different tractate seem to be contradicting each other. What's the difference? Or, I understand what the Gemara is saying now, but I have a logical misunderstanding. I disagree with the Gemara. And a true Talmudic scholar never disagrees with the Gemara. What does he say? He says, not the Gemara doesn't make sense. Oh, the amount of teachers that told me you never use the words the Gemara doesn't make sense. You say, I don't understand the Gemara, right? And you struggle to make the Gemara make sense. Why? Because you appreciate that these sages of the Talmud were way more advanced than you. And so when you come to what they're saying and you don't understand what they're saying, you try and make it make sense. And that's Tosfot. You go through Tosfot, which again is on page 228, it's the left-hand side of the Talmud. It's not a running commentary, by the way. They don't explain every word. They just pick and choose. You can see here on page 228, on the left-hand side, you can see the date. On this page, they only have 4 commentary. See how each one starts with a bold quote from the Talmud? They're quoting the Talmud in bold, and then the rest of it is their commentary. There's 2 small ones at the top, and then 2 semi-larger ones towards the bottom. These are all asking questions, giving answers, and it's not one scholar. This is a collection of scholars that were all put together eventually into the Tosfot And again, that could be a whole class in and of itself, the Bali Tosfot and how they came to be. Rabbi Shlomo Luria, otherwise known as the Marshal, explains what exactly the Tosfot were trying to do. Why would you make the Gemara more complicated? When you already have a Gemara, there's questions and answers, there's a sugya, you're trying to follow it, you're trying to halt cup to hold your head, and then comes Tosfot that makes things even more complicated. What are they trying to do? Text 9 explains. Elise, can you read for us, please? Rounding out of the Talmud on page 230.
All right. They made the Talmud like a ball, spinning it and rolling it from place to place until it was all smooth and interconnected.
Tosfot, says the Maharshal, refined the entire Talmud. They were taking the Talmud, which had many bumps and crevices, was very rough, and they said, let's smoothen it out. There are logical inconsistencies, and it's only logical inconsistency if you're looking at it at a surface level. Look a little deeper, and then you can get rid of that logical inconsistency, right? Or probably the most important, the biggest issue that made it very raw was the contradictions between different places in the Talmud. But again, only contradiction if you look at it on a surface level, right? You go a little deeper, and it's going to make a lot more sense. Now, all of this is what Tosfos did, but there's been a lot more since Tosfot, right? Tosfot ended kind of in the 13th, 14th century is when Tosfot ends. But after Tosfot had already introduced a new style of learning. You're not just giving a commentary in order to explain what the Gemara is doing. You are coming up with your own novelay. You found a question on the Talmud. You appreciated with humility that it's not that the Gemara doesn't make sense, it's that I don't understand it, and maybe there's many other people that misunderstand it the same way I do, and even you come up with a solution to make the Gemara smoother, to make the Gemara make more sense, right? Ever since Tosfot, there have been lots of chidushim, lots of novel insights that have been, and that's, for the most part, most commentary since Tosfot until today are chidushim, what I would call novelay, or novel insights into the Talmud. And there are lots of different styles. Some of them are commentary on Tosfot, breaking down the insights of Tosfot and other authorities, seeking to trace how these scholars understood the sugya. Some of them point out and resolve apparent what seems to be contradictions between different comments of earlier commentary on commentary on commentary. But yet other ones are going beneath the surface. They're saying, I want to uncover hidden meaning within Talmudic passages. Some of them, for example, are referencing the Kabbalah and bringing the Kabbalah into the Talmud and saying, oh, when the Gemara says this, the Gemara is referencing a particular Kabbalistic concept, or this strange story that you see is a particular Kabbalistic concept. Other ones are much more laser focused on halacha. I'm not getting distracted by Kabbalah. I'm not getting distracted by logical inconsistencies. I trust the Gemara. I'm just trying to get to the halacha. All different sorts of commentary, all coming and giving chidushim or giving their novel insights into the Torah. All of them embodying the teaching of Ben Bagbag. Mark, if I can ask you to read for us, please, on page 231, text 10. Don't forget to unmute yourself, yes? It's all in the Talmud.
Then Bag said, turn it over and turn it over again, for it contains everything. Look into it, grow gray and old over it, and do not budge from it, for you have no better portion than it.
Beautiful. But Bagbag is encouraging us to keep pluming the depths of the Torah because there is more and more in it. Remember, Talmudic study is essentially, as we discussed in lesson 1, trying to uncover a godly wisdom, and godly wisdom by its very definition is unlimited. So yes, you might be learning the Gemara right now with one understanding of it, but if you find a question and you uncover another understanding of it, even if those two are contradictory, so if it affects halacha, then you need to figure that out. But as long as you're not trying to figure out how to practically observe the laws and the practices of Judaism, it's encouraged to turn over and uncover more and more depth in the Gemara and in the Torah as much as you can, because there is so much in it. Now, the big question now is, how valid are all these novelay? Let's say I'm a very novice, beginner student of Talmud. I open up the Talmud and I say, oh, this page of Talmud doesn't make sense. Okay, and then I take a little humility and I say, oh, it's not that it doesn't make sense, that I don't understand it. So I figure out an answer to my question. Who says that my new novel idea of Torah is actually something valid? Ron, can you read for us, please? Text 11, Insights from Sinai.
The insights that a veteran student will, in the future, say in front of his teacher were all given to Moses at Mount Sinai.
Thank you. This teaching is wonderfully empowering. Why? Because it tells a novice student, you think you're just bringing something new? Essentially, this was all included in the Torah that was given from Moses at Sinai by God to the Jewish people. All of these new novel insights that will be introduced by students later on were all included. With one condition. You have to be what we call a veteran student. Is that how they translated it? Yeah. Talmud Vatik. You have to be a veteran student. So on the one hand, in other words, any new idea, right? The student who developed that idea is credited with innovating it. But on the other hand, it goes all the way back to Sinai, right? The key limitation is that it has to come from a veteran student. What does it mean to be a veteran student? It means nothing more, nothing less than someone that is committed to, deeply committed, I would say, to the principles of Torah. He's internalized the ways of thinking of the Talmud. And by applying those traditional principles to Torah study, he can come up with new depths of understanding and insight. Dave, if you can read for us, please, text 12a on page 232.
Seeing that all the innovations in Torah must be built on the principles that Moses received from Mount Sinai, it emerges that all was given to Moses at Sinai. Nonetheless, when a veteran student toils with their mind to reveal a specific idea within the oral Torah, an idea that accords with the Torah's principles, they create something truly original in Torah.
Here the Rebbe is saying that it's actually a duty, it's part of what we're supposed to be doing, to partner with God and to use our own brains to actually parse out new ideas in the Torah. You know, in the secular fields of literature, there is this common question called authorial intent, right? In other words, what did the author mean? For example, with regards to the Constitution, many people are worried about it, right? What did the framers of the Constitution, what did the founders of our country, what did they really have in mind with the Second Amendment, right? And it's argued out in court and this, and all of it is about authorial intent. But when you remember that the author that we're talking about here is God himself, and that God could have meant two things at once. In fact, he can mean 1.5 million things at once. And there's lots of depth to it on multiple layers of understanding, then that question falls away. It's not about what God had intended in the Torah. When it comes to halacha, you need to figure out one way. But when it comes to everything else, it's about the way you choose to take the word of God into your hands and to make that, as long as you're following the principles of the Torah, it's about the way you bring some sort of new idea that used to be concealed in the Torah, and you bring it out and reveal it. And the Rebbe used to encourage this like it was nobody's business. He would tell people, you have to ask, and you have to write, and you have to give essays. And Ron, if you can read for us, please, where the Rebbe would encourage people to innovate. On page 233, the obligation to innovate.
Every Jew has the obligation not only to study that which is already published in sacred books, but also to innovate.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to take a minute to play for you a video, which is kind of a summary of one of the Rebbe's campaigns to get people to innovate in studying the Torah. Please turn your attention to the video screen.
Tradition and innovation are oxymorons. Tradition means preserving the past. Innovation demands change. But the Jewish nation excels at both, constantly generating fresh interpretations of traditional texts, because the Torah's ancient guidelines allow for endless originality of thought. In recent times, the Lubavitcher Rebbe treated the Torah's tradition of creativity to an unprecedented innovation of its own.
אף על פי was פלפולי די רייסה ist הדבר הכי גודל, aber בנגיע zu drucken das und nefit sein, ist lei כל הרייסה ליטל לסק, jitel, es darf sein mehr nicht wie die, was haben auf drauf, Aira, Brur, als sollen damit echt vernehmen, beschasse geworden die Riedes Haderis, und Limud Hatera, Alpi Klolle Hatera, und Bedarke Hatera, und in Memese Ifanim, dafür haben Asirus Miyuchan, und aidet miyuchot v'chulhu, der Fall ist gedei, auf mir ede sein und misave sein. Und die alle, was kann sein, als seine Scheiche zu Chidush und Teire.
The Rebbe handed the keys of innovation to whomever studies Torah. He campaigned for students of every age and stage of knowledge to seek and discover novel insights within all the classic works of the Jewish tradition, and to publicize those discoveries.
Ich habe gebeten, Menschen bekommen mit Kenntnis, dass die Schiffs, was gibt mir Reis, Kifze, Aloche, Kifze, Chidushim, der Rosh Schiff, viele von den älteren Bochern, from the Seich Tankshin, for the Bochern, but the Walle sind auch nicht älter. Ich als Bocher viel, dass man erwartet, man soll etwas mechanisch sein, ist bekommt Cheshek.
Back in 1986, Rabbi Ruvi New was a student who hesitatingly heeded the Rebbe's call. He submitted what he thought was an original challenge to a text of Rashi's commentary on the Torah to his yeshiva's journal. His entry was then read by the Rebbe himself.
A question popped into my head, which I quickly suppressed. I thought that was something, for the big leaguers. One of the members of the editorial board said, put all of those calculations to the side. This is what the Rebbe wants, so just write it. My question is the first one published because it's the first Rashi of Bamidbar. And then I see on the bottom a note from the editor, Rabbi Galitsky. The question has been dealt with extensively by some of the classic commentaries on Rashi. The person who submitted the question did not take the time to do any research and look into Rashi's commentaries. So, you talk about being thrown under the bus. Anyway, the next day, it came to that point of the Farbrengen where the Rebbe was now going to talk about the Rashi. He said, the question was submitted about the first Rashi. I remember like shaking like a leaf. Then he says, even though the commentaries address this issue, in light of the fact that the person who submitted the question also asked a similar question from the beginning of Parshas Bahar, means that we therefore need to find a singular answer that can resolve the question both from the beginning of Bamidbar and also Bahar. The Rebbe then proceeded to give a beautiful explanation as to both Rashis. After the Farbrengen, the first person that I looked for was Rabbi Galitsky. He said no, with a big smile on his face. He said, no, the Rebbe is angenommen for dir. The Rebbe defended you.
Every Jew is encouraged to drink from the divine well springs of Torah wisdom. And every Jew is empowered to become a fountain of fresh Torah ideas.
The Rebbe's message was very, very clear. The Rebbe was saying, yes, I know not every question is going to be a groundbreaking question. And could be even, there'll be other commentary that asks that same question. But that doesn't absolve you from the challenge that Ben Bagba gave us, which was hafachba v'hafachba dekula va. Turn it over and plume the depths of the Torah. Why? Because there's more there. There's everything in there. Your idea, your perspective might be a perspective that nobody has uncovered until today. And that's fine. That's fine. That doesn't take away from the other perspectives. It's God's will we're talking about here. It's God's wisdom that we're talking about here. And if that's the case, then there are unlimited interpretations of it, if you will. And we need to uncover all of those by us getting personally involved in the Torah and using our own brains to come up with questions and answers, etc. Then we are actually contributing to that conversation that has continued from Sinai down till today. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, to answer our other question, the second question, How has that conversation continued till today? It continues until this very Zoom. There are ideas that I shared here that are my understanding of the way these texts unfold, etc. Right? And when you study Torah, you bring your ideas to the table. And sometimes those novelay are big enough that they actually become a larger part of the conversation. And so I want to take an opportunity now to conclude and reflect on the entire course that we've been experiencing, that we've been journeying through, if you will, this tour through the Talmud that we've been taking over the past 6 weeks. At the beginning of the course, we shared a story. In 13th century France, the Jews had their Talmuds confiscated and were burned, and this loss was treated as a national catastrophe, so much so that we mourn it every year on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av. And I promised, that over this course of 6 weeks, we would gain an understanding of why the Talmud's loss, the notion that perhaps we had lost the Talmud forever, was such a profoundly emotional moment for Jews. And I hope that over the past 6 weeks, you have learned not just one reason, but 6 separate reasons for why it is that the Talmud remains accessible to every Jew thanks to generations of perseverance, and why it's so important to study Talmud. In lesson 1, when the topic of discussion was the source of halacha, we learned that the Talmud is not just the source of halacha, the Talmud is the repository, of all oral law, the instructions for that which we can live up to the covenant that we made with God in Mount Sinai. And so if you study Talmud for no other reason, study it because that is the source of all law. You can't just open the Shulchan Aruch and learn the Jewish code of law. You have to go to the source. Another reason we discussed in lesson 1 was that when you study Talmud, you are literally communing with God. Because Ana Nafshi Ketavit Yahavit, God has taken himself, and right, that was the acronym of the word Anochi, the first of the 10 commandments. God says, I have taken myself and put myself in the Torah. You can do that by studying a verse in the Torah, or you can get down and dirty with that verse in the Torah by opening the Talmud and unpacking that verse for the thousands of different questions and perspectives and details that it has in it. And that's what happens when we study Talmud. Our minds become immersed in trying to understand the will of God. In lesson 2, we learned that the written Torah is not just halacha. It's not just Jewish law. It's not just the source of how we observe our commandments. It's not just a communion with God and actual divine service. It's more than that. It's the oral tradition, right? Which is intended to be engraved in our memories, right? And we can have an active relationship with it by actively putting it into our brains. In lesson 3, we learned the value of diversity. Different opinions in the Talmud. That's not a problem. That's a beautiful thing. It's a problem when it comes to halacha, and we need to figure out how to follow the law. But it's actually a beautiful part of the diversity, the different perspectives, and how all those different perspectives form the Judaism that we have today. In lesson 4, we learned about deeper meanings, especially in the Agada section, right? These strange stories or strange statements that are made in the Talmud, like, why do the dark goats walk before the... We've learned that there are deep, meaningful insights in the Talmud. So if you don't study the Talmud because it's the oral law, or because it's the source of halacha, or because you're communing with God, or because of the diverse opinions that it has, study it for the deep insights that it can have into your own personal life. For example, like that darkness comes before light. If you remember, that was a few weeks ago when we studied that. It was right after the fires, and a lot of people took personal resonance in that from what's going on in their lives right now, that they find themselves in a time of darkness, and that darkness is the beginning of light, right? There are lots of these deep messages in the Talmud. And finally, last week we learned about the importance of thinking like a Talmudist, of questioning everything, of gaining this unique way of thinking and looking at the world, but particularly a unique way of thinking and looking at our Judaism and at the Torah, which is not taking anything for granted and examining everything. And I'd like to conclude by giving you guys some contemporary regiments. These are choices for you. We're done. I've decoded the Talmud for you. Hopefully you don't look at it now as a cryptic book. You understand what it is. You know the history of it. You've even studied some samples, and you understand what you're going to be getting yourself into when you study Talmud. There's going to be some inspirational messages. There's going to be some Agadata. There's going to be some stories. There's also going to be some deep analytical thinking. There's going to be understanding the Mishnah. All of it, right? And I hope that you will take that journey and you will actually try and figure out a way for you to contemporarily study Talmud. Let me present some options. Number 1, obviously, is here at Chabad, we are privileged to have a weekly Talmud class with Rabbi Pinson. They just started a brand new tractate last week. They started the tractate of Avodah Zarah. You can join him by attending the class every week on Tuesday. You have the book, and he'll guide you through it. Not as for dummies, if you will, as we've been doing in this course, because in this course we've really been trying to understand how the Talmud works. That's not going to be the goal of the Talmud class. It's going to be to get through the tractate. But you can join him, and he will take you step by step, holding your hand through the tractate. Another option is something called Chalukas Hashas. And this is what's discussed in text 13. Ron, can you read it for us, please? From Rabbi Chaim Chizkiyahu Medini. Lived in the 19th century. And he talks about the shared credit. He talks about the concept of splitting the entire Talmud between many people, each one taking one tractate. Go ahead.
If a mitzvah is performed by several people jointly, each participant is rewarded as if they have performed the entire mitzvah alone. For this reason, the entire Jewish people have embraced the practice of forming Chervot Shas, Talmud study clubs, for the sake of dividing the study of the entire Talmud between many individuals.
So imagine if you're part of a split of the entire Talmud. What does that mean? It means that you are going to study one tractate over the course of the next year, for example, right? And when you study that tractate, you're not the only one studying. There are 63 other people, each one took on a tractate, or some people took on half a tractate if it's a long one. And together you finish the whole thing. That's a very powerful way of studying Gemara, even if you're not going to be able to finish the entire Shas on your own. Some other options are Ein Yaakov, which I think I've mentioned in the past. There's an English version of it if you'd like. Ein Yaakov is a book that has a collection of only the Agadata, that's the stories and the moral and ethical teachings and the strange statements that the Talmud has all over, right? So that's another way of studying Talmud. Or perhaps this is not exactly Talmud itself, but this is the same idea, just many generations later. Today we discussed the Rambam. The Rambam has a code of Jewish law known as the Mishnah Torah, which we discussed. And you don't have to even study the whole thing. You can do a mitzvah a day. For those of you that attend the daily minyan here, prayers in the morning, Rabbi Anoka announces the mitzvah of the day every day. You explore the mitzvah of that day a little bit every day. And if you'd like to do this on your own, I encourage you to go to chabad.org/daily study. And over there you can sign up for an email where every day they'll email you a brief digest about one mitzvah. It's from the Talmud, but it's been codified by Maimonides. That's another way of accessing, in a contemporary regiment in your life, the Talmud and all of this wisdom. And if you think it's too late, I have to remind you that you will never be the latest to start. There were always many rabbis. This happened forever throughout Jewish history. There were those that came late to study Torah or to study Talmud and were able to do so. And we'll conclude with the story of Rabbi Akiva, which, Dave, if I can ask you to read it for us, please. Text 14 on page 238. Rabbi Akiva was a late bloomer when it came to studying Torah.
How did Rabbi Akiva begin his journey to scholarship? It is told that he was 40 years old and had never studied in his life. But he was once standing at the mouth of a well and asked, "Who carved a hole in this stone over here?" The people there told him, "It was formed by the water that constantly drips onto it, striking the same spot day after day." Rabbi Akiva told himself, if a substance so soft can carve its way through material so hard, then surely the words of Torah that are like iron can engrave themselves within my heart, which is mere flesh and blood. He immediately set out to start studying Torah. He went with his young son, and they sat down before the teachers of the young children. He said to one, "Rabbi, teach me Torah." He then took hold of one end of the tablet, and his son took hold of the other end. The teacher wrote down Aleph and Bet for him, and he studied those two letters. He continued studying until he had mastered the entire Torah.
Rabbi Akiva thought of his heart as impenetrable stone. He said, "I'm too old, it's too late for me." But he eventually became, in the end, one of the highest heights. He reached the highest heights of Torah scholar that any Torah scholar has ever attained. So I encourage every single one of you, as we're concluding this 6-week journey, the 6-week introductory tour of the Talmud, I want to encourage you not to make this the graduation of Talmud, but actually the initiation to Talmud, right? That you should either buy a tractate and go through it on your own, or probably better yet, take a class whether that's with Rabbi Pinson, or whether that's elsewhere, whether that's online, or whether that's in person, but to actually begin to explore this amazing work that we've been touring and observing over the past 6 weeks. And hopefully that can be a good takeaway from this course as a whole. With that, I would like to ask you to turn your attention to the video screens for a brief summary of today's lesson.
Lesson 6. The Talmud until today. 1. The Talmud's rulings became binding for the entire Jewish nation because they are the consensus of the sages and were accepted by the Jewish people worldwide. After its completion, Jewish communities were dispersed in exile. New halachic decisions by local rabbis were binding within their own communities, not universally. 2. Deriving halacha from the Talmud has always been challenging, and expert scholars were consulted for guidance through responsa. Halachic digests, like the halachot of the Rif, simplified the Talmud's discussions, making practical rulings more accessible by omitting lengthy debates. 3. Rambam's Mishnah Torah organized Jewish law systematically, offering clear presentations of halachic rulings derived from the Talmud. The Shulchan Aruch by Rabbi Yosef Karo, with Rabbi Moshe Isserlis's glosses, became the most accepted code, incorporating numerous halachic opinions and addressing new questions and customs. 4. Rashi's explanatory commentaries help students understand the Talmud's complex, unpunctuated text. The Tosafot created by Rashi's students uncover new depths of Talmudic insight by resolving questions and contradictions in the Talmud's text. 5. All true Torah innovations were already given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Every generation of scholars builds on previous works, uncovering new insights and layers of meaning. Every Jew has the potential to contribute novel insights to the Talmud. 6. Today, there are various methods for studying Talmud, making the study of Talmud accessible to everyone. These approaches allow for both in-depth study and fast-paced learning, accommodating learners at all levels. 7. Rabbi Akiva's story inspires all Jews to pursue Talmud study regardless of prior knowledge. Each of us is able to begin the journey to scholarship.
Thank you all for joining me on this 6-week journey of decoding the Talmud. It has been an absolute humbling honor to teach you, and I hope that you have felt that I have done your time the service that it deserves, and you've actually gained quite a bit over the course of this course. And I'd like to encourage you to join me for the next course, which is starting May 5th. It's 4 weeks this time, and it's called Colorful Profiles. Just want to give you a brief idea of what these 4 lessons are going to be about. I mentioned it earlier at the beginning of the class, but now let me give it a proper presentation. In lesson 1, which is titled Courageous Converts, we will be learning about 3 famous converts from not Jewish to Jewish. Number 1 is Onkelos. Number 2 is Ovadia of Normandy. And number 3 is Avraham ben Avraham. If you haven't heard of these people, you will be surprised at just how much you can learn from them, both about conversion and about our devotion to Judaism and about how deeply we study Torah, and perhaps we can learn from them how to have a deeper approach. In lesson 2, which is called Influential Jews, we are going to learn about Jews that influence non-Jews and perhaps averted many of the most potentially biggest Jewish disasters to the Jewish people. Have you ever heard of Shmuel HaNagid, or Menashe ben Yisrael, or Ovadia Sefarno? if you join us for this course, I will take you on a journey to explore who each of these people were historically and just how much we can learn from them about anti-Semitism and about being a light unto the nations and about how our relationships with the non-Jews around us ought to be. In lesson 3, which is titled Unsung Heroines, we will be discussing Doña Garcia, less famous Jewish women who should be famous, right? Unsung Jewish heroines. Doña Garcia, Rebbitzin Bela Katz, and Glickl of Hameln. And if you haven't heard of these people, I encourage you to join me as we learn from them about nurturing our families and the role that Jewish women and in general Jews should play in their communities, and about how women have helped guaranteeing Jewish survival over the generations. And finally, in lesson 4, which is titled Heroes and Hostages, we will learn about the 4 captives and how they forever changed the course of Jewish history. We'll learn about the Maharam of Rottenburg, and we'll learn about Rabbi Yaakov Koppel of Margolis and how each of them in their hostage crisis. If we think hostage crisis started in 2023, we are gravely mistaken. There have been lots of hostage crises in general for Jews, and Judaism has a lot to say about how we deal with those hostage crises. If you'd like to learn about that, that's going to be discussed in lesson 4. I hope you will all join me for that course. Again, there is a 10% discount for returning students. As long as you register by the end of this week before Shabbat, 10% off. You can text me or you can sign up yourself at chabadpasadena.com/JLI. Thank you all.